So challenging outlook right now, where employers are still planning to increase staff more than decrease staff. And CIPD data saying there was a 47% chance, or 47% have said it's hard to fill vacancies.
Yeah.
So in this webinar today, we're going to be talking about our data. So we've got data from around 3,000 people from our surveys. And in this webinar today, Rob Robson, Director of People Science, and myself, the CEO of the People Experience Hub, are going to be talking about where our data has come from, what it's showing us, and in particular concentrating on that retention and advocacy piece. I'm super excited to go through this. And is there any context that I've missed in that quick summary for the people joining on Zoom, Rob?
No, I think so. No. I just think that, you know, it's counter to a lot of people's experience that the economic situation isn't great, but retention is still a really important topic. People are still looking to keep people. Still a lot of competition out there for talent.
Brilliant. So it's probably worth talking through our framework and how we as a business got to that framework. And I guess, I mean, I'll set the scene. And from our point of view as a business, one of the things we did in the very early days was we had a very flexible approach in terms of how we built surveys, how we asked questions, and how we went out and managed the processes that we did with our clients. I think that flexible approach worked quite well, but one of the things we learned from that was, number one, we didn't want a rigid framework. We didn't want something where you ask X number of questions and that says that you can unknit the culture of what's going on in your organization. And I remember having the conversation with you, Rob, which was, can we have something that gives us a freedom within a framework? So can we have something that is backed by science that we can stand behind? But ultimately, how do we go forward with this and create something? So I remember setting that challenge, but it'd be useful, I think, for everyone if you could take everyone through the framework before we get into it, and how that helps us think about things like outcomes, like retention and advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just. So before I launch into this, I think there's a few things that we noticed from our own experiences and from talking to people. And first was that people are struggling. We consistently hear people struggle to take action from their survey results, and I think that's ultimately a lot of that is a lack of insight. And you can't have insight without a guiding framework. Really, you don't really know what the data is telling you other than the raw descriptive stuff. Then I think the other thing is that what we've seen out there is that, generally speaking, what you see from an employee survey, it doesn't really reflect the sort of, or help you through that sort of complexity of the system that an organization is. So there's, what you're dealing with out there is actually quite interrelated and complex, but what you're measuring is just like very sort of linear and straightforward. And then I think the other thing we noticed is that there's a bit of a disconnect really between a lot of employee surveys, just the idea that everything's just focused on employee engagement, and sort of the idea that HR should contribute to business outcomes. So, when I started working on this, there's a few things that I had in mind. I wanted to keep that flexibility, so we keep quite an open framework. It's not overly detailed, although there's plenty behind it, and we want to retain that. And then I also wanted to kind of build that bridge to actually what's important to the business. So when I looked at quite a lot of psychological research. My background is as a chartered psychologist. I had an interest for a long time in employee engagement and stuff like that. So I spent a lot of time in the research, and there's basically a consistent theme here that across an awful lot of psychological sort of work out there, which is this idea of 3 levels. and in the psychology, it's almost like think, feel, do. And in our framework, that relates to, first of all, what we call outcomes. And so typically we regard, engagement as an outcome, although it's what a lot of people would call employee engagement is a little bit scattered into the felt experience as well. But the motivational and aspects and behavioral aspects of engagement we consider to be outcomes. But it's not just about engagement. It could be well-being, it can be performance behaviors. And what we'll be talking about today is as indicators of retention and advocacy are questions around intention to stay and willingness to recommend. Then we've got the felt experience, which is the piece in the middle, the feel part. Do people feel that they have autonomy? Do they have a sense of belonging, connection with each other, so relationships? Do they enjoy their work? Do they believe they're growing? And do they have a sense of purpose? And then there's the environment. So what do they think they're seeing? What's their assessment, if you like, of the environment around them and the organization? So that's where you get things like line management, leadership, communication, people practices, organizational effectiveness, sustainability, well-being practices. So these are really the controllable parts of the management system, if you like, or the things that as a business you can actually change. The felt experience are the things that you can influence, but you can't specifically change. And then they have an impact on those outcomes.
And I guess from my point of view, Rob, I mean, the bit that I was delighted in, we're going to get into the data and into what it's showing us in a minute, is that, I presented this to a group of business leaders this week in London, and last week I was presenting it to a client's board. And it feels like we're able to move away from, almost kind of nebulous concepts and into stuff that people can do. And I think it was one of our clients that actually said, it feels like what we've got here is controllables, variables, and outcomes. And the stuff that we can really influence is the environment, and then, lead that through. But what's important to us is the outcome. And what we're trying to influence is that outcome. So yes, we want people to have great line management, but the business case for doing that is not just the human one, but also that we want people to stay.
Yeah. If you're not careful, with a survey, you can just end up with a shopping list. Okay, we've got all these things that we need to improve, but what's the most important? And you end up being drawn to the lowest scoring items, which we know are not necessarily the most important thing.
Yeah.
And that's all about analysis.
So let's get into it. Let's just get into it. So we've got data from several thousand responses to surveys, and I would love for you to now take everyone through what is the data telling us.
Okay. So let me first explain what you're looking at. So you're looking at spaghetti. We call it, so this is sometimes known as a Sankey chart. What we're looking at here is, so if you think about a correlation, when X goes up, Y goes up, right? That's a correlation. When you look at, say, drivers of engagement, what we're generally using there, at least good practice would be to use what they call a regression analysis. So that suggests is that if X and Y and Z go up, then so does A. But which one of those, or which ones of those, are having the most influence? So not independent of each other, looking at those interrelationships a little bit. What this does is it takes it to another level, and it says, if this, then that, and then that. Okay, so it's like it's a bit like drivers of drivers of drivers of engagement. It doesn't have to be engagement, and that's one of the things that we're so keen to emphasize with people, is that a lot of organizations feel so locked in to the idea of employee engagement, but it doesn't have to be the only outcome. Okay, so what we're looking at here is it specifically for the indicator of retention, which is I intend to be working here in 12 months' time, is that within the felt experience, That's being influenced by, I enjoy being at work, my job allows me to make full use of my knowledge, skills, and ability, and I'm proud to work for this organization. And those in turn are being influenced by a number of things. So you look at line management, people practices is the orange, green is, is about well-being. That's a huge question there. My organization actively supports the well-being of its people. So communication is in there, organizational effectiveness is in there. And some of this, when you look at that, let's say you look at that piece in the middle, I enjoy being at work, my job allows me to make full use of my knowledge, and I'm proud to work for this organization. You might go, oh yeah, obviously those impact upon retention. But what this doesn't show is all the things that have less influence or don't show a statistical relationship with that outcome. So we've got questions that were in this analysis around things like belonging, but connection, relationships, and autonomy, for example. So that doesn't mean they're not necessarily important overall, but in terms of this analysis, it's only 3 questions out of about 12 that show up in the middle. And then you can see on the left-hand side, those levers, if you like, that you can pull that would influence those.
And just, a question for me then on this, Rob, and I know we're going to cover later on about, that this is the data, this is all of the data, this is, across multiple organizations, multiple industries, this is a top view of retention, and we are pulling out the felt experience here. And I guess the important thing for people, watching this webinar or listening to this, everyone is going to be different, aren't they? And I know we're talking about storytelling later, but
yeah,
everyone's will be different. So this is the view we're taking here is a fairly global view of, this is the biggest impacts and the biggest.
Yeah, each of our clients would have their own unique, pathway analysis. So we call it a pathway analysis, or a mediation analysis is the other term that's used for it. And so yeah, every client would have its own. And by the way, if anyone has any questions as they go along, please do raise them, because we're really interested to know, what people's initial reaction is to this data. So there's a question through already. How did we get to those 3 felt experiences? Are they the most common in the data? Yes. So what you see on the screen is actually only those relationships that show up as being statistically significant. So there are some that sort of show some sort of a relationship, but they're not. They don't pass the test of not occurring due to chance. So we have about in total with all of our clients, we've asked around about 18 questions around the felt experience around those 6 dimensions. But when we came to the analysis, in truth, we could only use the more commonly asked questions for the analysis, because if you've got large gaps in your data, the statistical analysis fails. It falls over. It doesn't like it. But we were still able to use about, I think, 11 or 12 questions from the felt experience. So those 3 that you see on the screen are the statistically significant relationships. Okay.
So I have a question. And yeah. So my question is, if I'm looking at this and I have that, obviously it makes sense. People who enjoy work use their knowledge and they're proud and they can move forward. Are the lines representative? So the proud line is thicker than the enjoy line, and thicker again than the full end. Is that relevant?
Yes, good point. It is. So what the lines is, and if we were looking at this in a different tool, we would actually be able to click on it and see the numbers behind this. But because we're looking at it in this environment, it's a little bit different. The thickness of the line represents 2 things really. On the right-hand side, between felt experience and outcome, it reflects 2 things. It reflects both the number and the thickness of the lines that are going into it. And generally speaking, from the perceived environment to the felt experience, the thickness of the line represents the strength of the relationship. So you see when you're going from level 1 to level 2, there's not too much difference in the thickness of the line. That's because there's not a huge variation in that strength of relationship. You can see that there's quite a thick one from my organization actively supports the well-being of its people to I'm proud to work for this organization. And probably the thinnest one is also from my organization actively supports the well-being of its people, and that going into my job allows me to make full use of my knowledge, skills, and ability. So that says that the thicker line is a stronger relationship than the thinner line. In other words, if there's a 1 unit change in the thicker line, it will have a bigger impact.
I've got it. And I've had a question come in to me. Why does a manager setting challenging goals and expectations lead to pride in the organization?
It's a good question, isn't it? Because there's a because this is a statistical model, fundamentally all that says is there's a relationship between the way that people respond to that. But what it suggests to me is I think that because I was reading, you have to do some interpretation into this, and so what I would hypothesize is that my work feels more meaningful if my manager sets challenging goals or expectations for me, or maybe feels more like I matter. What I do matter. So it potentially is cementing that relationship that you have with the organization. I think this does raise one of the questions around this, and we'll be talking about how we use this data later, because and we'll get into this in a bit more, so I won't go into too much now. But there's 2 ways of looking at this. One is that you can sort of go to the left-hand side and go, okay, what factors do I need to look at? What might I put in my checklist of things that I need to work on? And those are the things on the left-hand side. And then there's the bit in the middle, and you can say, well, okay, let's look at the experience. Let's start talking to people about their experience and what doesn't provide that experience for them. But there's this piece that we have to remember is that any employee survey can only ever ask so many questions. So it's part of what you have to do with the output is to think about, okay, that piece about line management, my manager set challenging goals or expectations for me, should be the stimulus for a conversation. Further discussion about line management, or it could be a further conversation about pride. And so what do we always do with our clients is not encourage them to take a linear approach, which is, here's a question, it's a low-scoring question, right? What's my action to fix that question? But to use it to inform a discussion. Mm-hmm. So it's not perfect. No survey is ever perfect. So, and what we're saying here is, oh, that's interesting. Like you say, my manager sets challenging goals or expectations for me, leading to I'm more proud to work for this organization. I think that basically is I feel I achieve more, then I start to feel a greater sense of pride, something to that effect.
And I think before we move on to look at advocacy, I mean, I guess when I look at this and I think about times when I have been in operational roles where we've looked at retention, where we've looked at how do we improve stuff, we're often presented with a statistic. We're often presented with I intend to be working in 12 months' time, X% of people said that. And I think this is a move away from that. And it's even a move away from those drivers of engagement that you'll often see in surveys. So for me, this is about going, if I think back when I was a line manager in a distribution center, I would struggle to know what to do with stuff like drivers of engagement without some context, some training, stuff like that. Yeah, but understanding that I need to care about people and communicate and make it simple to do my job, and to focus on people's well-being and give people challenging tasks. Now that might be training I receive in my role as a manager, but it's all very relatable to me, where intention to be working here, 58% of people say they do, therefore 42% say they don't. I struggle to cope with that. So for me, I think what we're seeing here is a move away from standalone statistics that may be useful to get people excited about a number, to talk about a number, so they have their place. What we're moving to is, how do you actually take action to change an outcome? How do you take action to do something a little bit different?
And I'd love to, before we move on, I'd love to hear what people, what people would emit, just if we put the challenge out there. So what do you think you would be doing as a result of this information? What if you had to take action on it, where would your focus be? How would you respond to it? I would love to hear if people have their own thoughts about that at this point.
Mm-hmm. So is there anyone in the chat or anyone in LinkedIn? If you could drop some comments in, that would be great.
But if people are shy, then we can move on and show the retention data, not the retention data, the advocacy.
Well, let's move on to the advocacy, give people a chance to think about what questions they might have, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, we can always answer them live. Now, the advocacy, now it's kind of similar, but you can see that it's actually the only thing in the experience that really shows up as statistically significant every time. Statistically significant is, I'm proud to work for this organization. So there's a really clear message there, isn't it?
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, it's a really clear message. If you want people to stay, one of the first things you should be thinking about is, am I making them proud to be here?
Yeah. So in terms of advocacy, this is people going out into the world, to their communities, to their friends, online. They defend the company, they recommend the company, they promote the company. I mean, the core question we've used here is about recommend. My organization is a great place to work. It's the question, the question when you're down the gym doing your spin, if you're able to speak and someone says, who do you work for? And I work for this company. Are they any good? What they like, and you want someone to be enthused, and we won't be enthused every day, life's not like that. But generally what we're saying, I mean, reading this in the way that you described it, get people to be proud and they will recommend. And whilst there's other influences, the key statistical driver is this. So if we want promoters, and I'm going to talk about my my pet hate, which is Net Promoter Score. When somebody turned that into an NPS, we knew that Net Promoter as a measure was a failed and flawed measure. We knew that when people started to try and use Net Promoter for employee measures of, promoters, it almost feels to me like this starts becoming that replacement. What do you replace a flawed measure with when it's the only option that's out there? It's almost like actually you replace it with something like this. How do we drive that? Not just asking the question and putting someone into a mix. It's what do we do to create the experience that really drives it? And I'd guess you said before that this is the top level, and I'm guessing at a company level, we may see more felt experience in there at a different company. So we may see that in one company it's about belonging and pride.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a key point, is that because this is what's common across a range of organizations, it's one of the reasons why perhaps fewer factors are coming out, but that's consistency across different businesses. And I'll just pick up on a comment from Andy on LinkedIn, that the model does make it easier to distinguish between manager and leadership development work, where policies and practices need work. Love it. So thank you, Andy. I just want to take you back a slide for a second, because you mentioned questions. One of the things as well is that when we look at this one, the level 3 question here, I intend to be working here 12 months time, is a very deliberate choice. A lot of surveys I've seen, they ask, do I see myself working here in 12 months time, which is quite passive. It doesn't really ask whether you actually want to be there. It just asks whether you think you might be there. So this is just a deliberately more sort of active question to be asking.
I'm going to. I'm sorry. I'm going to jump in off script on that as well, and I'm going to defend it a little bit. I think, which is about understanding where it comes from. And I think whenever we run surveys, whenever any feedback company runs surveys, and I've seen it with, the people we partner with to, run surveys to joint clients, to competitors. It's a difficult question because, what you're trying to do is not do anything that is direct, and you want people to think about it. And I can understand why a passive question would be asked, but I think what you're saying is, a passive question is less helpful when it comes to really exploring an outcome, and you need something that's a little bit more direct.
Yeah, you could see yourself working here in 12 months' time and hate it.
Yeah.
And so from an analytical point of view, you need to be able to create that level of clarity. I'm going to go back just to this one because it's got more information on it, because we're going to talk a bit more about making use of it all, aren't we?
Yeah.
So I think we talked a little bit about the different approaches you can take. And that is, so like I say, you can sort of take a little bit of a shopping list approach and say, right, so the things on my list that we need to do some work on are line management, our people practices, flexible working, training, etc. We need to be seen to be actively supporting well-being. We need to communicate change more openly, and our processes need to work. Okay, great. Those are some things that we can start working on. And some of those are quite big ticket items. That's fine. Equally, you can go out to people and then say, right, because people, often organizations will run focus groups, or they'll do exec connect type things where, or HR will go out and they will do listening groups. It could give you a focus to those sorts of things. So you can go out and say, okay, as I could mention before, right, so the topic today is pride. What does make you feel proud to work here? And you can treat that as an AI kind of appreciative inquiry type question, but you can also add in okay, so what gets in the way of that? And so you've got on one hand a bunch of things you can start thinking about because they're likely to have a positive influence. On the other hand, you can use it to really start to dig in qualitatively and give that qualitative approach a focus. Whereas when you're starting with a blank page and just saying, well, what do you like about working here? What do you not like about working here? You're going to cover a lot of the same territory. You're going to go back, and it's a fairly inefficient way of doing all that sort of stuff because it's going to give you a lot of data that you're going to have to work with. Whereas if you start to focus in on some of these experiential themes, then you can really do something with that. We've got another comment.
There's a couple of questions actually, Rob, and we'll come back to, because the stuff you're talking about is about taking action and those experiential themes. We'll come back to that. So I think Robin has made a statement around, people want to feel, as we've said here, that they belong, to feel valued and able to contribute. So the overall employee value proposition would be something to focus on. And I guess from that perspective, that whole proposition around how people experience work, rather than it being that value proposition, which is typically something around reward focus, pay and benefits and learning development, but that overall holistic approach, I think is probably absolutely right. How do you design work for the experience that drives the outcome? And Paul Tanner has asked a great question. I think this is a fab question because it is the challenges of ENPS, and we can respond to this. So one of the many challenges of ENPS is that it doesn't deal very well with international and cultural differences. And does our model enable us to get enterprise level insights, or is it best deployed at a local geographic unit level? So I guess the question there is, I'll interpret that is there a minimum number of people that you can push that to, and how do you take it from a top level and start cutting that back? And can you start saying this is the pathway at a company level and start filtering that down?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing is there's a piece here about doing a survey with international companies, and we know from our experience that even once you start translating questions, there's a lot of work to do to make sure that people are getting a consistent experience in terms of the survey itself. But I think when it comes down to this, it depends very much on the size of the organization. So when you're working with a large enterprise, what we can do is we can run this analysis for for different units, different geographies, etc. And you will start to see at least subtle differences. When we're working with a slightly smaller organization, a mid-size, it's often best just to do it at an organizational level, because obviously when you're dealing with what's quite a sophisticated statistical technique, you then do need a decent number of people. And in my experience, it's at least a couple hundred people. The more the merrier in many respects. I mean, we did see with a public sector, emergency services client, the organizational pathway just didn't show anything. It didn't look like anything at all. So we separated it out into the emergency response population from the corporate. And then we started to see, okay, that is because there's two very different pictures here. And so sometimes actually you do need to, there is some value, I think, to saying, okay, overall, there's something going on at the organizational level, at the highest level. But if you've got the populations, then there's value in doing that.
So, I mean, a lot of this is great, and obviously, I mean, I'm going to say it's great. It's our company, and I love a Sankey chart. Who doesn't? But I guess ultimately, it's pointless if action doesn't get taken. And what we're trying to do here is help organizations be outcome focused and the outcomes that are important to them. I mean, it's not the only goal of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's something that is something that we're able to help them focus on. Are there outcomes that you are focusing on? Are there outcomes that are important to you about your people or your business? So in terms of helping somebody just take an action and maybe focus on the retention stuff as well, because I know we've got an ebook that's going to be shared after this. What should people do? How should they take action and use this data to influence that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We have touched on it. So you've got different routes into action. That's one of the beauties of this is that you've got the direct route, which is on the left hand side. You've got a number of things that you can start working on, and you can take that as a guide, and that's kind of similar to what you might do generally with drivers of engagement on what people have in other surveys. And you can have confidence that they will have a positive impact. But like I say, you've also got that second route into it, just to start with the experience and think about the experience we're trying to create, and then look at, well, what levers can we pull that maybe we didn't ask about in the survey? Because sometimes, as you know, Nick, sometimes a client will come to us and say, I'm not running a survey with more than 25 questions. And typically a survey will have about 40 to 50, and we will try and craft something that is really applicable to their needs, their challenges, their unique demands. But when you're dealing with, say, 25 or even 40 questions, what is you're not asking about everything. You can't cover every base in your survey. So and at the same time, even if you could ask 100 questions and you might cover just about every base, but but you lose people along the way. So we have to accept that there's a little bit of a compromise in there. So I think it's really important for people, even when you start working from that left-hand side, to say, there might be some elements here that we need to explore further. This is not going to give us all the answers. This is going to give us some places to look. I always talk about surveys as about that, lifting up, telling us which rocks to lift up, and it sometimes a bit more will crawl out from underneath. Yeah.
I'm gonna come back to some specific actions as we close this, and particularly ones we can take around retention.
Yeah.
And I think, I think the important thing is, what I've seen with data, with analysis, people, whether that's people analytics or anything, any analysis that comes into the business, is you've got to be able to tell a story.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to build some narrative around it. And I'm a waffling, rambling storyteller at best when it comes to stuff. But I have to say, one of the things that I found is when I'm presenting, and I think I've talked, presenting to some senior leaders this week that are operational, C-suite, board level, what I'm finding is that actually when I'm using the pathway analysis to build my narrative, to talk about the flow of people's experience through the workplace to an outcome, be that retention or be that well-being, whatever that may be. So people's ability to cope with pressure at work was one I was talking about the other day. I was finding that people that it was more difficult to engage with. So people who were more analytical, people who were heading people insights teams, people who were maybe CFOs or chief marketing officers. It was a lot easier to engage actually when we were using something like the pathway and taking data and talking about it in context that they understood. It felt better, and the statistical side of it really helped. But I mean, if you think about telling an effective story with data, how can people start thinking about that, Rob?
So one of the things that we don't have on the slide here, because of neatness and presentation, is we don't have the actual scores on here. So the first thing you can do is you can actually sort of narrow this down a little bit more and say, okay, which of these are actually high scoring, things that we should celebrate and protect, and which of these things are lower scoring? Because obviously high scoring drivers are just things that you should be, keeping going. Low scoring drivers are real opportunities for impact. And so what we do when we build our recommendations is we'll be looking at both the high and low scoring elements of experience, saying this experience is something that needs to be nurtured and protected, and there's things that influence are this. So if I'm proud to work for your organization is, even if it's high scoring, you may have elements going into that. So for example, my manager sets challenging goals or expectations for me. It might be relatively low scoring and say, people are proud to work for those organizations, but that's a risk. So there's this sort of numerical aspect of telling the story, but there's also the bit of telling the story, which is about being able to layer things up a bit and say, people want to stay here when they feel proud to work here, and the things that influence that are, whether managers set that challenging expectations for them. It's about whether they have flexible working, whether they feel that they're getting the training they need, etc. So it's to be able to say, to build that sort of slightly more rich picture when you're making a case, because we all have to make a case internally for investment, say that when this, then this, and this, and to be able to link that to an outcome that has essentially a monetary value. That retention piece has a monetary value, and we'd encourage people to be able to use outcomes, not only just engagement, but think about things that actually do link to what's important to them as a business. Then you make a far more compelling case that than you otherwise would if you were just saying, okay, it's fair enough if you can say, look, our line management is relatively low scoring and it affects engagement. That's fine. But it's stronger if you can A, make that link, and B, say it's both hearts and minds, if you like. The minds part of it is this is having an impact potentially having an impact on our bottom line, and the hearts part is people feel much more proud to work here when the line manager is effective.
And I'd guess when people are telling a story, we're talking about this global level data, and it's more helpful when it's your own story. When it's your own story as a company, when you're seeing this pathway as your own analysis and your own pathway to it, it's easier to tell that story because you've got that internal context. And I think back to a recent bit of feedback, which was you've written my line manager training business case for me, and it's a case that I've struggled to get over the line for the last 3 years, and all of a sudden I've got the budget.
Yeah.
And it's about understanding that the difference between I need to work here and I need to nurture this. And I think that's really, I think that is really, really important. I mean, I'm going to, we're 45 minutes in, we've got 15 minutes to go, and I want to be able to make sure that people can ask questions if they do want to ask some questions. So I'm going to open it up again and just see if anyone's got anything that they want to ask, and if there's anything, and it could be about any of this, you know, different outcomes. I mean, we're focusing on retention and advocacy here, and the reason we're doing that is because at the moment it feels like retention is a focus for people in the world right now. And we also know that advocacy actually supports that. So if your people are advocates, they're the biggest recruitment team. So you know, if people are out there recruiting and advocating your organization, then that's super important too.
Absolutely. And the message is very similar. Interestingly, it's not always that similar when we look at an individual client, but when we look across our clients, the message is very similar. It's just more focused for advocacy. Pride, you know, and that makes sense as well, isn't it? I mean, it's good when it's one thing seeing the statistical analysis. Another thing is saying, well, that makes perfect sense. If I'm proud to work here, I'm going to tell people. You know, and I don't need an inducement. I don't need an incentive to tell people that they should work here. And then you've got the things that are influencing that. We've got a question from LinkedIn as well. Andy Gorham. Thanks, Andy. Nice to see you here. This may be a daft question, but how does the model pick out things that are low scoring but would strongly influence the desired outcome? So all this analysis actually tells you is that these are influential. But of course, when we actually run the survey, we also have the scores for the specific questions in mind. So we overlay the influence with that score, and so it's easy for us to see. This doesn't tell us inherently the spaghetti, if you like, and the thickness of the spaghetti is how much of an influence is this question having. So then we overlay that with the actual score. Do you think the word advocacy needs to be unpacked at senior leadership level so that understand its meaning and what needs to happen for it to be successful? Yeah, I think so. I think, again, you know, that's from Robin Ridgely on LinkedIn. Let's go to the advocacy one. I think you have to be careful with words. It's like the engagement thing, right? When you talk about, you go to a room and you say, you know, this is an influence on engagement. You know, half the people in the room will go, what's engagement anyway? Or half the room will have one idea of what you're talking about, and half the room will have another you know, idea entirely. And I think it's really important to get to work with not just work with conceptual ideas. And so what we've labeled advocacy is actually an indicator of whether people would recommend their organization as a great place to work. So I think you know, I would actually, to unpack that at senior leadership level, I would say these are the things that influence whether someone would recommend our organization as a great place to work. I wouldn't actually describe it in that context as advocacy. You know, try and keep the language as clear and simple as possible.
Yeah, well, it's a good. Oh, I can hear a dog. And I mean, it's good. I mean, we ummed and ahed about advocacy, and should we call it advocacy? Should we call it? And you know, it's what you're up against. You're up against promoters. And I mean, I guess as well. And I know we've got some. We're going to wrap up in a second, but we've got some people from people analytics and people insights functions as well on the team. And I guess building that story piece as well, the bit I'd recommend, you know, having put analytics teams into companies and manage that is this is a source of data, but it's not your only source of data. And you've got what it can do is it can complement and enrich all that other data that comes in. And I think it's really important that people recognize that a survey isn't the only piece of data to respond to, that the outcomes and the outputs from that survey are to be layered up against other data in the organization. And if you're looking at recommendation, if you're looking at retention, then you need to start looking at, if you have something like an employee referral scheme, are people using it? When was the last time somebody referred someone into your organization? How often does it happen? How many vacancies are filled from internal recommendations? Retention, to overlay that with exit data or stay data, people who are staying in the organization, to explore that with them, whether that's focus groups or other data, or whether people are, like you said, Rob, are they staying but they're not performing? I think we've had quiet quitting has suddenly become a popular phrase, but it's always been there. That whole, I'm going to work to rule, or I'm going to do the minimum required of me. It's not new, but it's something that people can explore as part of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to, because we're into the last few minutes, so I'm going to summarize some of the action areas, and I'm going to focus on retention. Some of this is from our ebook, so it's going to be in there. But so what we've seen today is that actually, using a pathway analysis, we can start looking at things like retention and recommendation advocacy as outcomes, and we can start looking at the flow from the environment and to the experience into the outcome. But some of the action areas that we've pulled out that might be helpful for people to improve retention are, helping line managers to be better at both challenging and supporting their teams. There's also a basis of resilience, providing better access, greater access to flexible working. So we've seen that within this data, haven't we? And we can see that actually, if you're struggling to talk about flexible working in an organization, if there's somebody who's not quite on board with that, this is a great part of that business case. Training, making sure that processes work, that get stuff done. The comment the other day made to me around this from an operator was, we need to get out of the way of people doing their jobs and just let them crack on. And if we've got processes in place that stop that, it's going to cause a problem. Well-being and communication, so we all know that well-being is important, and what we've seen so much is that well-being is an agenda driven by well-being suppliers, but we know it's important, and we know it's important actually not just because it's a human need, you care about me, must support my well-being, but actually, our data is here showing us that actually supporting the well-being of an individual, leads to pride. It leads to people enjoying their work. It leads to them being able to get on and do their stuff without fear of, their own well-being being an issue. So, I mean, in terms of wrapping up, we will be sending out copies of our ebooks. It's going to go onto our website in the next week. We'll send copies out to people that have joined this webinar. I don't think there's any more questions that are coming in, but we've got a few more minutes if anyone has got anything. But I guess, Rob, how would you, if you're going to close this, how would you close it? What should people do next when they're thinking about outcomes? And if somebody wants to talk to you, Rob, about this at more length, if somebody wants to grab a coffee with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, I think that, in terms of the outcomes and where you want to start with this, because we've also mentioned one of our ebooks, which is about, actually building the people experience. And I start with the whole thing about starting with outcomes there is if you're not sure, get out and talk, and actually talk to people and say, what is it, rather than just thinking about, I'm going to measure engagement, which most clients want to do, but think beyond that and think about, what do I want to see here? What do we want people to do differently? What are the things that we expect of our people that are likely to then impact upon our business success? And start thinking in those terms, then think about the experiences that underpin those. And that this data can help that, but you can actually draw some logical connections there anyway. And then start to put once you've got that feeling of what kind of outcomes you want and what kind of experiences you want to create, then think about what levers can I pull, and you can put them under the microscope in terms of that. So that was a bit about outcomes. And then if people do want to get in touch, you can email me directly at rob@pxhub.io. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter as Robert S. Robson. and I'm not on much else, to be honest. Don't try me on Instagram.
Not on MySpace. Not going to hit you up.
No.
That's fine.
not doing. I can't even think of the name of some of the other ones. That one that TikTok, no TikTok.
that TikTok on the internet. So it's been. I've really enjoyed this webinar, and I've enjoyed it because, you know, I genuinely, like I set up at the beginning, I genuinely feel this is something that will help people. I think it's a piece where someone can take this away and do something with it. And I'd like to thank you, Rob, for the work that you and your team have done on this, and, you know, everyone that's joined, Robin, Andy, Vanessa, for the questions that have come through. And hopefully the next webinar will be just as stimulating, Andy.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining.